This may sound like an unpopular opinion, with 87% of Americans disagreeing with me on the topic of getting rid of the 22nd Amendment. And I already know some of the comments I may hear, such as, why the hell would we want to get rid of term limits for the president? It's one of the greatest amendments ever added to the U.S. Constitution. And, in fact, if they're good enough for the White House, they would make a fine addition to U.S. representatives and senators as well. I'm tired of our government being the most exclusive nursing home for 80 to 90-year-olds who freeze up giving a press conference, or who can't form or speak a coherent sentence. I want newer and younger voices running our government who are more suited to lead our country in the 21st century. The Founding Fathers envisioned our leaders to be statesmen who would serve and then go back home when their time is up. Plus, without term limits, America will fall into dictatorship as well. I understand these arguments, and your opinions are worth listening to, because I also am frustrated with Congress being dysfunctional and also the two-party system as well. But I respectfully disagree with your opinions, because I believe term limits will do more harm than good. For one, term limits are inherently undemocratic because they take away voters' rights to choose. On top of that, the benefits of not having term limits is that it gives our country greater flexibility to keep someone in office when we're in a national emergency. And finally, limiting politicians to a set number of terms also increases polarization as well. This is why I believe the 22nd Amendment ought to be repealed, because it's undemocratic, increases flexibility, and also it increases polarization as well. I want you all to be open-minded and listen to what I have to say, because in the end, we can all be agents of change that can truly reimagine America and all of our states for generations to come. So let's get started, shall we?
What President Truman said in his testimony was, quote, "My position on this question is a very simple one. This is a bad amendment. It ought to be repealed."
For one, term limits are undemocratic, plain and simple. As a democratic republic that our country was founded upon, we citizens of the United States of America have the right to vote for our representatives, senators, governors, state legislators, mayors, and so forth to run our federal, state, and local governments. If we're unhappy with the current government, we have the right to vote them out, to put in new people who will do a better job at serving us than what the previous status quo has done. We have done this in the 2018 election. We did it in the 2020 election. We also did it in 2022, and we're about to do it again in 2024. But if we're happy with the status quo, we also have the right to reward them with another term or even a larger majority in the legislature, because they have done a great job in governing our state both domestically and internationally as well. Our 34th president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, even voiced strong opposition to the 22nd Amendment when he ran and won the 1952 presidential election, in which he quotes, "The United States ought to be able to choose for its president anybody it wants, regardless of the number of terms he has served." This quote correlates to what I'm saying, and that is the fact that we, the people of the United States of America, should have the full freedom to choose anybody, regardless of race, gender, party affiliation, and so forth, the job to serve as president, regardless of how long they serve. It's similar to the notion that if someone, say an employee who works in retail and who is a manager of that store, is already experienced and is doing a great job in running that store, he or she should also be rewarded as well, such as getting a raise or even getting a promotion. But if that person is not doing a great job, then they are simply let go, fired, and replaced with another person who may do a better job than the previous one. This logic is the same idea to what we already have in our politics, and that is through our system of elections and debates to hold our government accountable and to ensure they represent the interest of the American people, both in the majority and minority factions. Most of all, term limits restrict voter choice to reward and punish elected officials. Despite it being an undemocratic mechanism, having no term limits for any elected official also increases flexibility. You all may be asking me, what in the heck do I mean about increasing flexibility? I mean that it rewards our effective incumbents to continue to specialize as they gain more institutional knowledge of our political system, and also whenever we are in a national emergency. But to go even further, according to one article titled The 22nd Amendment, A Practical Remedy or Partisan Maneuver by Stephen W. Status, he talked about how the Democrats argued that the two-term tradition was wisely broken, in which he quotes, "The Democrats argued that the two-term tradition had been broken, and wisely so, by Roosevelt because of the extraordinary emergency which arose with the Second World War, in which the survival of the nation was at stake. A change in the presidency at such a time, they reasoned, would have been dangerous to the country. The American people agreed in both 1940 and 1944. This was the democratic way of deciding the question: to prohibit the re-election of an experienced and popular president in a time of extreme national emergency, the Democrats reasoned, would invite rather than prevent dictatorship. Sometimes it's okay to keep the status quo in our government because it's necessary for stability and when our nation's democracy is at stake. If we just vote out an incumbent without thinking of the consequences that it may bring, such as instability, for instance, then it will invite greater instability and new problems we would have to face. We have already faced this in our current time already. We have seen what happens when we kick out an incumbent and replace them with an inexperienced and original person.
Minimizing the economic burden of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act pending repeal.
Okay.
When former President Donald Trump first took office, he signed his first executive order that scaled back the Affordable Care Act regulations. For instance, according to one source by the Time titled, "Here's Everything Donald Trump Did During His First Day as President," that talked about all the actions that the former president did once he was sworn in which they quote, "In his first executive order signed in the Oval Office, Trump directed government agencies to scale back Affordable Care Act regulations, allowing agencies to delay or waive provisions of the law, thereby beginning to roll back it before an official repeal by Congress, the New York Times reported. This is the consequence of kicking out a previous administration without thinking, because a new person who comes into the public eye can, by a stroke of a pen, begin to start undoing everything that the previous administration accomplished. This can create new problems that our country faces, and it can generate instability as well, because we have seen during the years of 2017 through 2018 what Republicans did on health care. The president's party had no health care plan at all. They just wanted a complete repeal of Obamacare. And guess what would have happened if Trump and Republicans had their way? Over 40 million individuals would have lost health insurance who rely on the Affordable Care Act, even the people that have pre-existing conditions as well. When the main purpose of the Affordable Care Act was to help Americans have greater access to affordable and quality health care, to just suddenly being taken away from them for good. This creates instability in the healthcare industry, and it will leave millions of Americans with no health insurance. The point that I'm saying here is that things take time to implement. You see, when politicians are first elected into public office, they have to educate themselves of how the institution works. They have to foster good working relationships with senators, representatives, and even the president to pass their agenda. As well, when they start implementing their policies, the effects towards those policies also take time as well. As one person once said in a movie, you can't rush art. It's a slow process to make progress. We just have to learn to be patient. Overall, the benefits of no term limits increases flexibility by rewarding popularity and expertise. Finally, term limits also increase polarization as well.
Amendment, he said, had been passed by, quote, Republican haters who sold the country a bill of goods. Never able to defeat Franklin Roosevelt while he was alive, they tried to take their spite out on him after he was dead.
The biggest supporters behind the 22nd Amendment were Republicans and Southern Democrats. Both factions had two different reasons in supporting the two-term limit for the president. The Republicans wanted to limit the president's term to only 2 as a slur on the memory of former President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was our only president to serve 4 consecutive terms. This was in part because the GOP lost to Roosevelt 4 times, and they wanted to make a lame duck out of every second-term president. This is something we are dealing with now. You see, members of Congress can stall a second-term president for long enough to get him out of office. This is in part because representatives and senators have no term limits. This already happened when former President Obama was in office between 2009 through 2017. Republicans, after the 2010 midterm elections, purposefully stalled the president's agenda for long enough until he left office on the month and year of January 20th 2017. This sort of strategy that Republicans did to Obama by making him a lame duck president is the same partisan power grab that the GOP did to stain FDR's legacy when pushing for the two-term limit. The grand old party pushed this amendment through by not giving the opposition a chance for rebuttal against the amendment, and only getting it done behind closed doors as well, with hardly any media coverage. But despite the partisan maneuver that Republicans did due to their anger of never defeating FDR, they still needed support from Democrats, and the support that they got from one of the factions within the Democratic Party were angry Southern Democrats. You see, during the New Deal, the GOP formed a tightened and ineffective alliance with Democrats from the South who were both against Roosevelt's economic policies. Southern Democrats were only motivated to vote for the 22nd Amendment as a protest vote towards FDR and Truman's economic policies, because to Southerners, they believed that restricting the president to only 2 terms would reduce the leadership potential of a president that believes in advancing civil rights programs in the South to better the life of African Americans. This is a really terrible and partisan amendment which ought to be repealed, because it is only advocated by those who want to gain and preserve their dominance in society, like those racist Southern Democrats. Speaking of it being a partisan power grab, according to one article by James Fallow titled "Washington and the Contract with America," he talked about how the contract that Republicans such as Newt Gingrich both committed themselves to get done within 100 days they take power, also argued for limiting representatives and senators' terms as a way for them to gain power, in which he quotes, "Shortly after the election, Army suggested that with Republicans in control of the House, maybe the nation's desire for term limits will be diminished. Other Republican leaders have indicated that when the Citizen Legislature Act comes to the floor, it will have a grandfather clause, nowhere mentioned in the contract, exempting today's representatives and senators from replacement by citizen legislatures." This connects to what I had been saying all along, and that is the fact that term limits lead to more partisanship. You see, it was only advocated by Republicans to gain control of the lower house of Congress, and when they do come into power, their desire in advocating for citizen legislatures will soon die out. Because even if they vote for term limits, they are essentially voting for their own retirements, and that is something no politician, being a Democrat or a Republican, will do, unless if they are exempted, because to them, they are the grandfathers who deserve to stay in office for life. I'm talking to you, Senator Ted Cruz and Senator Ron Johnson. All in all, term limits are a partisan power grab advocated by those who just want efficacy. Most of all, term limits will not create a functional and representative government. It will only increase polarization, decrease flexibility by not allowing popular politicians to specialize on a specific issue, and it will only make our nation less and less democratic. I believe in democracy. I believe in the voters of this incredible nation to hold our government accountable through systems of elections that we have every 2 years, every 6 years, and every 4 years as well. I understand why many of you may disagree with me on this topic, because you are just tired of career politicians and the dysfunction that is currently going on in Washington, D.C., and so am I also. But there are better alternatives to repair our broken democracy, and some of those better reform proposals would be expanding the size of the House of Representatives, getting rid of first-past-the-post voting to another voting system such as ranked choice voting, star voting, proportional representation, where 20% of the vote means 20% of the seats in Congress, to ensure voters can truly vote for the government they want. And all of those alternatives won't need a constitutional amendment. Congress would just have to pass those proposals with only a simple majority. I overall believe in the principles of our democracy, in allowing voters to reward and punish the president through systems of elections and debates, regardless of how many times he or she runs. This is why the 22nd Amendment ought to be repealed. Ideally, though, I would want just no term limits for all 3 elected officials, being representatives, senators, and the president. But I am open to compromising with those who still want term limits. So here's my compromise. I want 3 consecutive terms for the president, 2 consecutive terms for senators, increase representative term lengths from 2 to 4 year terms, with their election years being on presidential election years as well, and also limited to 3 consecutive terms like the president. So this way, politicians can run for office, serve their nation and their communities. Then they go back home. After they reached the maximum time, they can run for re-election. And if there's cry by the public that they want a former politician to come back into public life, then they can do that by running for a non-consecutive term. This, in my opinion, is a better system, though I still prefer no term limits, because we already have a system in place to hold politicians accountable, and that is by re-electing them or voting them out of office. So let me hear where you guys stand on this issue in the comment section below. Do you guys agree or disagree with me? Share your opinions in the comment section below, but please be civil and respectful to those that disagree. Remember, we can all be agents of change to reimagine America for generations to come. Thank you.